So what I'll present for you today is some work from my ongoing book project that is entitled Moderating Extremism, the Challenge of Combating Online Harms, which addresses a growing yet understudied set of questions at the intersection of technology and security, particularly when it comes to social media platforms. So, oh, this does not go, sorry. All right, awesome. So, so the regulation of social media platforms as kind of this broad topic has been one of the most contested and, debated policy issues in recent years. We have governments as well as technology platforms increasingly taking efforts or trying to take efforts to combat various types of harms. This includes misinformation, hate speech, terrorist propaganda, other types of influence operations. But in this area, armed groups in particular have been the main targets of moderation. In recent years, we've seen technology platforms increasingly engage in the removal of content that is praising these groups. They have imposed bans on the ideologies that these groups promote. They have been downranking content that is affiliated with these groups, and even all the way have been deplatforming their accounts. So we have a really large and growing set of actions that technology platforms are engaging in to combat the content that armed groups propagate. And you can see some of this on the figure on the left here, on the right, or your left, that essentially shows the many, many millions of pieces of content related to armed groups that some of the largest platforms have been taking down over the years. And you can see that this is a growing trend. So this is something that has been happening and is continually happening. But despite all of these efforts, we still see a lot of groups highly active on social media platforms, disseminating propaganda, attracting supporters, and also inspiring violence. This figure here comes from a data collection I did for the book that shows the number of groups, and I'll talk about this data shortly, that as of summer 2021 had active accounts on the platforms you see here. And we see that there is a lot of presence of different types of armed groups on platforms, both on the large platforms that we all know, as well as on smaller platforms as well. So this raises this question that really motivates the book, which is how do these militant groups that are continually, essentially being disrupted, on social media platforms, continue to advance their cause online despite all of these disruptions? We don't have a lot of literature yet on this topic, perhaps because it's such a new thing, or in some ways a new thing. But we have some other types of literature that can help us shed light on this question. The first one is the large body of work on counterterrorism or counterinsurgency that has pointed to different factors that allow these groups to remain resilient to repression in the offline world. So some insights from this work has found, for example, that having networks of supporters or civilian backing is something that has historically helped different groups to build resilience to repression. Similarly, is having organizational mechanisms for replacing targeted members. Important for my argument today is essentially the presence of multiple bases, or having safe havens, or even being transnational is something that has helped groups become resilient to different types of repression efforts by governments. We also have this growing, not related to this, but a different strand of work on censorship that has focused particularly, as of yet, on authoritarian regimes, and also has pointed to different factors that allow citizens to become resilient to censorship. And this work has shown, for example, that it's really important that somebody knows that censorship is happening. So awareness to censorship is something that has been found to be important for evading it, as well as having some sort of political interest, or being an activist, or having a reason to evade it. I should say, though, that most of this work in censorship has so far focused on information consumption. So how can somebody who knows censorship is happening, will go and find that information nonetheless? And there's less work on the production of content, and this is something I will focus on today. So to answer this question, I argue that armed groups' resilience to moderation really lies in their ability to exploit cross-platform differences in content moderation. our online information environment today is characterized by a lot of different platforms, a lot of different online spaces on which groups can organize. So, and what I argue is that because of these different online spaces are governed differently, so they have different rules about what is allowed and not allowed on these spaces, it effectively creates some sort of online safe havens for armed groups to operate. But because those less moderated spaces or places that pose less restrictions on can also be smaller, where the audience is smaller, less people will actually pay attention, armed groups continue to seek ways to influence audiences on the larger platforms that are more moderated as well. And I argue that they're able to do so precisely because those larger platforms are transparent and public about how they moderate, which essentially allows groups to become creative and resilient to evading these moderation efforts on the larger platforms. What I'll also show you today is that the ability of armed groups to engage in these evasion mechanisms or adaptation that I list here is actually mitigated when platforms begin to collaborate and essentially unify their moderation standards. And I'll show you some evidence for that as well today. But this also raises an ethical question of whether we want actually platforms to have similar moderation standards. And hopefully we'll have some time to talk about this today. It might be in the Q&A. So to begin understanding how groups build resilience to moderation across different platforms, it's important to kind of understand what they actually want to do on these platforms. Or why do they use social media in the first place? So I build on a larger literature on this topic in my argument, and I basically assume that groups use social media platforms primarily for publicizing their cause, attracting supporters, and recruiting new members. And when they are facing this diverse and large ecosystem where there are many different platforms to choose from, they maximize two factors. The first is what I call purity, which is essentially the ability to freely post content that aligns with our ideology. So imagine that we are part of a group and we have an ideology that we want to propagate to the world. All else equal, we'll prefer platforms that allow us to do that the most, that we have the least amount of restrictions. The second factor is impact. So this is essentially how many people will see our message, how many people could be potentially become supporters or recruits. But in the world we're talking about, in this current information environment, it turns out that purity and impact are actually inversely correlated. I'll show you some evidence for that shortly, where on platforms that allow for high levels of purity, essentially are kind of free-for-all kind of platforms with very little moderation, they also tend to be the platforms that potential impacts is the lowest, right? So it's can be imagined like this fringe platform that no one heard of, right? And of course, the opposite is true as well. So the platforms where the impact could be the highest also moderate the most. So in this kind of restrictive environment, I argue that armed groups engage in three different tactics or mechanisms where they build resilience to moderation to nonetheless advance their cause online. The first one is migration, and that's probably what most of people hear about when people talk about those issues. Which essentially means establishing a presence on a different platform when faced with restrictions on a moderating platform. But what I argue here is that it's not just okay, we just faced deplatforming and bans on Facebook, let's go to some no-name platform. Actually, what I argue is that because armed groups, these actors, care about both purity and impact, they will actually tend to gravitate to the platforms that maximize both. So there's a particular set of platforms that will be the targets for migration. Second, I argue that armed groups are able to leverage audience grievances for moderation to attract supporters on those less moderated platforms. Essentially, I'll explain how this essentially works with an example, but just to give you an idea, when we talk about content moderation and enforcement of these growing rules to moderate speech, when technology platforms target these kinds of harms, they do not just target the accounts of the armed groups, right? They also target different types of content that can affect a lot of social media users. So what I argue is that through leveraging those grievances that users might have by having their accounts suspended or posts deleted, groups can use that for mobilization. And I'll show you some examples for that today as well. Lastly, I argue that even though armed groups kind of tend to focus on the less moderated platforms for migration and mobilization, they also engage in increasingly sophisticated ways to reach those high-impact large platforms by adapting how they communicate. They can do that either by kind of sacrificing the purity of their content to remain impactful on the large platforms. So essentially, that would mean some sort of self-censorship to continue having impact, or smuggling prohibited content under kind of under content that seems innocuous, and I'll show you some pretty creative examples for that the groups have been engaging in. So kind of going back into this like two-dimensional space of platforms, I argue that we'll most likely see migration and mobilization on platforms that allow for higher purity, so platforms that are less moderated but are smaller, and we're most likely to see messaging tactics on those larger but moderated platforms. So in the book, I use a lot of different types of evidence, both qualitative as well as quantitative, to shed light on these different mechanisms that groups are engaging in. And what I'll do today, I'll show you some of that. So first, I'll show you that when groups choose platforms in this environment, they tend to focus on the platforms that jointly maximize purity and impact. So if you were to see this kind of distribution, you'll see most migration happening in this space. Also, I'll show you that armed groups do leverage audience grievances from moderation for recruitment and mobilization on those less moderated platforms, and that they engage in adapting their messaging to reach those larger audiences as well. And lastly, I'll show you what happens when platforms begin to align their moderation threshold. So essentially, the variation you see on this axis will essentially flatten out when platforms begin to have the same standards. And I'll show you kind of how that affects armed groups' activity on the platform. Okay, so since so much of my argument relies on this trade-off between purity and impact, it's prudent to first test that this trade-off actually exists in the real world, or the virtual world. So what I did was to collect data on the content moderation policies of over 60 different social media platforms, both large and small, by closely reading their community standard documentations as well as terms of service, from which I created a variable that I call the moderation threshold. The moderation threshold is essentially a variable that summarizes 9 different categories of content moderation, and I'm happy to explain the details if you're interested after. But essentially, it's a variable that captures high levels of this variable would mean that a platform is allowing for high levels of purity, which essentially means that it's not moderating a lot, it's very permissive. And lower levels mean the platform is more restrictive. It might be a little counterintuitive, but I'm trying to fit this to the theoretical framework. Okay, so this is the moderation threshold. And in addition to that, I collected information on the size of the platforms, right? So how large the platform is, and we can measure that in different ways, like the monthly active users, web traffic, or app rank. When we plot these two variables against each other, we find that indeed there is a negative correlation between moderation and impact. So this y-axis here is essentially the moderation thresholds, where higher values of it allow for more purity, right? So more, content can be posted freely. And here you can see the platform size measured as monthly web traffic, but it looks the same if you use one of the other variables. So as you can see here, that there are some platforms, like the platforms we all know and hear about, like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, tend to be kind of in the lowest right corner, the platforms that have the largest audiences but are also moderating the most. And we also have platforms that maybe you haven't heard of, like ZeroNet and Friendica and others, that we know groups have been using, but have very little people using those platforms, and are also highly allowing, so they allow for high purity. So in this information environment, what do groups do? So first, I'll show you some evidence of migration. In order to kind of figure out where armed groups are kind of gravitating to. If you remember, my hypothesis was that there was going to be an attraction to particular types of platforms in that middle range. I collected information on the public presence of over 100 different militant groups on 12 of these platforms that I just showed you. And I collected information on both official as well as unofficial accounts affiliated with these groups, as well as the suspension status of these groups. So essentially, I wanted to see to what extent groups have been banned by a platform or not. It's possible to see that retroactively as well. So because I didn't want to just rely on selecting on a dependent variable, which essentially would mean, group social media presence, I relied on several external independent lists of militant organizations, one from the Mapping Militant Projects, or the MMP, that is based at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center Extremist Files database that lists a bunch of domestic hate groups within the United States. What I did was to use, essentially open source intelligence or some sort of observational passive collection of accounts affiliated with these groups on these platforms. You can see some screenshots of the collection that my wonderful team of research assistants and I have been finding. So you can see this is a screenshot of a group's account that we knew was present in the past, but was suspended on Facebook, that was suspended by the time we got to it. But we also found a bunch of active accounts, like the Patriots Front's presence on Telegram or Al-Shabaab's presence on TikTok. So overall, when we look at the data together, I found that the vast majority of the groups had social media presence. Maybe not surprisingly, about 86% of the groups in these two lists had at least one social media account that they used. And I also found that many groups use several platforms in parallel. So it was not just a group using a platform, but we had many groups use many platforms. On average, about five to 6 platforms by group, per group. And you can see that in the distribution here. There's the hypothesis about migration, kind of see, so do these groups maximize purity and impact when they choose platforms to engage in? I examined how their use of platforms varied with those two variables I was just describing. If groups maximize impact and purity, we would expect to see most of them gravitate to those platforms in that middle corner of the graph, right? We can easily test that with a regression framework, where the dependent variable would be a group's present on a platform, and the two independent variables will be the moderation threshold as well as the size. And essentially, I find support for this hypothesis. So first, in the first column here, you can see that both platform size as well as moderation positively correlate with having an active presence on a platform. But in column 2, that a lot of this variation is driven by platforms that are scoring high both on size as well as the moderation threshold, which seems to kind of suggest that most of the activity that I found with the data is kind of happening here on those platforms. What I'd like to show you next is kind of dig into one of these platforms to see how groups use those less moderated platforms for mobilization. So I'm going to focus on Gab, which is one of these platforms. So Gab is known as an alternative platform that has become really popular among far-right groups, in particular in the United States. Gab defines itself as a free speech social network, so by ideology, it moderates less. And you can see this in the screenshot here, CEO of the company, who was saying how Gab is a First Amendment company that tolerates offensive but legal speech. And because of those more permissive moderation policies, the platform actually experienced a really rapid in-migration of users right after January 6th, around the time where other platforms have been engaging in a lot of moderation, essentially shutting down a lot of accounts of users. So in order to examine kind of how groups might mobilize supporters on those less moderated platforms, I turned to the audience. And I study how social media users on a platform like Gab might engage with armed groups' narratives. Okay, so what I'd like to convince of you today is that less moderated platforms, even though they do have limited reach, right? They don't have the same amount of users like platforms like Facebook or Twitter may have. They can be really useful for mobilization, especially when their audience on those platforms find the narratives of groups really appealing. And what I argue is that what makes people in those platforms could be attracted to armed groups' propaganda efforts is actually content moderation. And the reason is that social media users who have personal experiences with moderation on those larger moderated platforms that end up kind of traveling to other platforms as a result, they are angry. They have grievances over moderation. So targeting those users who are angry for moderation can be really helpful for mobilization. I'll show you an example from Gab, but this same trend has happened in other groups on other platforms. So let me begin with an example. I think that would kind of illustrate the idea. So this is Alvin, a pseudonym for a social media user that is in this study. And Alvin has been, sorry, this is not working so well. Thank you. Alvin has been an active Twitter user, as well as a Trump supporter, who frequently posted on Twitter about conservative political issues. In the run-up to the 2020 elections, Alvin became agitated with Twitter's moderation, particularly of election-related content, and he often posted about his anger of moderation on Twitter. In November of 2020, he was actually suspended himself from Twitter by violating the platform's hate speech policies, an action he actually tried to appeal without success. So as a result, he started using his Gab account more frequently, and on Gab, he was more free to express what he was really thinking, so he engaged in a lot of hateful rhetoric about a bunch of different things, including Twitter's unjustified censorship. Over time, he became part of a growing community on Gab of users who believed that big tech was nefariously banning right-wing content. And as he was spending time on the platform, so you can click it again, thanks. Not sure why it's not. Okay, that's good. So as he was spending time on Gab, he became exposed to content posted by the Oath Keepers. Oath Keepers have been actively engaging in this kind of rhetoric on how media bias has resulted in the election, the election results of 2020. And if you kind of trace his timeline over time, you can see that he became actively supportive of the Oath Keepers, especially their efforts to stop the steal and defeat the coup, as well as he advertised the protest that they were organizing for January 6th that led to the storming of the US Capitol. So this is just one example, right? It's one user. We don't know if this, is part of a broader trend or if what I'm saying is actually holding up in a larger set of cases. So what I did then was to look at, thank you, of a broader set of users for which I had accounts both on two platforms, on Twitter and Gab in this case. And I'm happy to talk about the methodology behind this, but essentially I had data on users that had accounts on two platforms, and I was basically studying their behavior on two platforms over time passively. You can see here some screenshots of two users, two people that had account on Gab and on Twitter, on Gab and on Twitter. You can see that they were very similar. A lot of validation. I'm pretty sure we're talking here about the same individuals. So in order to study how a moderation activity by one platform could actually increase mobilization for an armed group on a less moderated platform, right? First, I collected information on Twitter's moderation, thank you, moderation activity, which included essentially the suspension of these accounts. So I was kind of tracking to see what happens to these 30,000 users for several months on Twitter. And I also studied, thank you. these users' behavior on both platforms. So both their posting, if you can, oh, there you go, posting of content that could lead to removal. So I studied kind of what they said on the two platforms, as well as their engagement in particular with the Oath Keepers because of the case study I was looking at. So this graph shows you the kind of the time trend in the suspension data that I was able to find. Overall, from September of 2020 to January, almost February of 2021, I found that over 2,000 users were deplatformed from Twitter. And you can see that even though there's this seems to be like two big waves here, suspension was taking place throughout the entire period. These two waves correspond to Twitter's enforcement actions around the QAnon conspiracy theory and January 6th. Let's see if that works. Oh, whoops. Maybe we can go back. Oh, perfect. So yeah, so what I did then was to see, okay, so does moderation cause users to be aggrieved? You know, something that could lead to perhaps mobilizing them later on. And I found a lot of grievances from moderation. So Twitter users who were deplatformed on Gab, on their Gab accounts, they were expressing a lot of anger over their moderation. They were cursing Twitter and talking about how much they hated the platform. And this figure here just shows you the amount of tweets that express frustration over moderation in the 2 days before and 2 days after. And you can see that a lot of the kind of grievances is spiking among deplatformed users. So to kind of more closely examine whether the moderation itself can lead to mobilization, I then engaged in a study that compared the overall activity of users, both those who were suspended and those who were not suspended, to see, that's good, to see whether suspended users might become more agitated and, essentially the audience becoming more susceptible to perhaps to propaganda. So I compared the online activity of a matched set of users, and I found that indeed users who were suspended, this is the before, this is the after suspension, you can see that those users who were suspended from Twitter became increasingly more hateful, toxic on Gab as a result. The more interesting thing, I think, is the next slide. Thank you so much for your help. Is that those same users who were suspended also began posting more about the Oath Keepers after their suspension. And I think that this illustrates a similar process to what we saw with Alvin, the example that I showed you before, that essentially being aggravated from moderation and then being, kind of told a story about how your experience is part of a broader effort to shut down your voice or others people's voices could be really effective for mobilization, even on those smaller platforms that are maybe will have a smaller audience. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, we have a little technical. So essentially, what I showed you so far is kind of how migration mobilization are really effective mechanisms for armed groups to use on those less moderated platforms. But if you remember, I started with saying, but wait a second, they also really want to do stuff here, right? Because that's where most people are located. I think this really stopped working. Oh, maybe not. I don't know. Okay, so to illustrate the importance of large platforms to groups, I'm going to shift to some other organizations, and I'll begin with a couple quotes. So this quote is a part of an interview given by the Taliban social media director to the BBC right after the group took over Afghanistan in summer of 2021. And and this individual was talking about how large social media platforms are really important for the Taliban, especially because of their ability to amplify their message. Next. Yeah. And another quote I think is kind of really illustrates that idea is coming from the Islamic State's Telegram activists that were talking about how as much as Telegram is a great platform for a lot of different purposes, it's really not good for proselytization because you will rarely find anyone from the general public on those platforms, and therefore the focus of their propaganda activities should continue to be on Twitter and Facebook, on those larger platforms. So to continue influencing audiences on larger platforms then, I argue that groups essentially need to change how they communicate, right? Because if they continue to do what they always have done, they will immediately get shut down and deplatformed. So I'm going to show you two examples of how that adaptation happens on those larger platforms. The first one will come from the Taliban's adaptation to Twitter rules, where essentially you see a sacrificing purity in order to access the larger impact, in order to prevent suspensions from happening. And the second one is leveraging knowledge about how those platforms moderate content in order to smuggle in content that would otherwise be removed, but kind of hidden under content that looks normal. And I'll use the Islamic State's Evasion on Facebook as an example. So the Taliban is a really interesting case because unlike other groups, it wasn't uniformly banned on all platforms. Well, some platforms like Facebook and Instagram, WhatsApp and YouTube officially banned the organization. So basically they said, you know, no matter what the Taliban is posting, we're going to ban them completely. So anything will be taken down. Where other platforms like Twitter and Telegram had more lenient policies. So in this language of this theoretical framework, they had higher thresholds, right? And Twitter's limited moderation of the Taliban was actually particularly interesting because it did contrast with how it moderated other armed groups. And in a statement explaining kind of its moderation decision, the platform said that even though they allow the Taliban to stay on the platform, they're going to be proactively enforcing their rules, you know, related to content that the groups could be posting that would violate the rules, but it particularly paying attention to policies that glorify content that glorifies violence, as well as platform manipulation and spam. So what I did then to kind of see, okay, so we have a group here that is allowed on a platform. We're talking about Twitter now. But its content is highly monitored. So if they post something that violates the rules, they might experience bans, right? So what I did was to collect information on 190 Taliban accounts on Twitter that included both the official spokesperson of the group as well as other prominent members. And I analyzed their content to kind of see the extent to which they glorified violence. And I found a lot of it, actually. I found quite a bit of content that celebrated different acts of violence that the group was engaging in, especially as it was taking over Afghanistan in summer of 2021. If you can go next, thank you. I can go next and one more. Yeah, perfect. So what I did is same with methodology. I was tracking, you know, the extent to which Twitter engaged in moderation, and then saw what these Taliban accounts did as a result. And what this figure here shows is that you can see the average number of posts that talk about violent attacks by these accounts over time. And you can see that there is an increase in those kinds of content that could violate Twitter's moderation policies, especially around glorification of violence, that kind of really shift after the group has experienced suspensions. This, of course, you know, kind of going into nitty-gritty methodological details, could be explained by other factors as well. So I didn't have time to bring it here, but I have information that shows very similar trends for other groups as well, that also take into account other possible alternative explanations for such kind of shift. But that essentially illustrates, in this example, illustrates the idea that groups that face moderation and want to stay on a large moderating platform can shift what they say kind of in order to remain active. So the last example I want to show you on this kind of adaptation of messaging is evasion, right? So once an armed group or any banned actor knows that how a platform moderates their content, they essentially can find creative ways to evade it. And what I'll show you is some examples from the Islamic State's adaptation to Twitter's moderation. So in order to remain active on Facebook, the group has been really creative in finding ways to trick the AI systems that moderate the group's content. A lot of these examples will come from some investigative work by a wonderful researcher at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. So credit to the screenshot is for him, not for me. But essentially, what these examples show is that the group's supporters on Facebook, in order to propagate its propaganda on the platform, have been increasingly posing as news agencies or even as terrorism research centers that essentially pretended to analyze Islamic State propaganda while actually, in fact, propagating its official message on the platform. They also have been, next, embedding the propaganda in content that seems like normal. Like this is an actual ISIS propaganda video that begins with a BBC News clip talking about Dua Lipa. Well, if you actually watch it a little more, you will see that it's actually ISIS propaganda. Another example here is showing the same thing with France News. Next. And there's even activity to evade moderation by hiding the logo. So you can see a Netflix logo here that, again, essentially changes the pixels in the videos and the images that kind of mess up with AI systems that classify propaganda. Another example is adding noise to images. So you can see just like putting white strikes and dots messes up with that, as well as adding dots to text, or even just adding English characters. So all of these are just kind of really creative ways where you can evade moderation on even a highly moderated platform by just changing how it appears, right? So this just is to my argument, is a direct function of being aware of moderation that allows for creativity and innovation in finding ways to evade. So all of these are a bunch of different examples that illustrate how armed groups use these different mechanisms to overcome moderation in this increasingly disruptive environment. We're trying to kind of limit what they do online. They nonetheless succeed. But the next thing the last thing I want to show you today is what happens when this variation actually decreases, right? So what happens when platforms begin to align their moderation thresholds? Do we see this actually as a solution to the problem? Logically, if divergence between platforms' policies allows groups to build resilience to moderation, then maybe convergence kind of would limit their ability to do so. So we can think about alignment in moderation between platforms could, thank you, at minimum mitigate the mobilization and migration mechanisms, because if you imagine if this variation becomes just like a flat line, it doesn't really make sense to move to the smaller platforms so much because they're going to have the same policy. Similarly, you can maybe make an argument that it will also limit evasion on those larger platforms, especially if knowledge about how evasion works, kind of moves between the platform's moderators and they know how to moderate it better. But this kind of alignment can also have costs, and there's this really interesting literature that I'm not going to go in detail today about that talks about how giving social media platforms so much power about moderation is something that we actually should be really scared about. We may not want that to happen. But nonetheless, what I did here was, that's going to be kind of the last example I'll give you today, is does moderation actually happen, right? We already have some few years where platforms have been engaging in content moderation. Is there actually convergence? So what I did here was to look at the same policies where I started with, if you remember, when I created the moderation threshold by analyzing the policies of the platform. But this time I actually looked historically. So I wanted to see, did these policies change over time? And thank you. And what I did was to essentially create the moderation threshold for all the different versions I could find online of the policies. If you're interested in how I did this, is really cool API from the Wayback Machine. You can actually observe the same version of a document over time. And you can see that indeed some platforms have been converging, right? You can see, some examples here in the graph. But I also found platforms that do not converge, right? So even though we have convergence, there are some that are not doing the same thing, which is kind of nice for a researcher like myself, because I can study whether moderation actually whether convergence in policies actually correlates with groups' activity online. So, if convergence allows platforms to effectively combat extremist groups or different versions of harmful content that they want to moderate, we would expect to see lower levels of activity of these actors on the platforms, in this case armed groups, and higher rates of suspension. This figure here shows you that this is what I find in the data. So going back to my 118 armed groups, I essentially looked at whether their online presence varies with the moderation convergence between platforms. So do platforms that converge their policies see less activity on their platforms? And this is what I find. So this is what this negative coefficient here essentially means, is that we see less official presence by groups on platforms that converge. We also see lower levels of unofficial presence, but this is not statistically significant. And of course, we see also higher rates of suspension. So we see more enforcement happening on converging platforms. So to summarize, I'm going back to the question where I started with, why do groups remain so resilient to moderation despite the efforts to disrupt their activities? What I hope to convince of you today was that cross-platform differences in the way moderation is happening is allowing these groups to build resilience through migration, mobilization, and messaging. But their ability to do so actually is mitigated when platforms begin to align their moderation policies. You can go to the next one. Thank you. Just a few takeaways, and this is very much work in progress. First, I think that this kind of work shows that we really do need to better understand the online behavior on less moderated platforms, where we tend to always focus on large platforms, and especially in the social sciences. We all study Twitter, we all study Facebook or YouTube, but there's so much more out there, and especially for questions like this one, it's important to understand those less known platforms. Also, what this work shows is that actions and moderation actions in particular that are happening on some platforms actually have spillover effects on other platforms. So we need to not only understand those less moderated platforms better, but we also need to know how actions, let's say on Twitter, affect behavior in Gab is also important. Lastly, next, what I show here also is that having more centralized moderation between different platforms could help, but it has costs. And in the book, I will talk to some length about these costs that include collateral damage. For example, I haven't talked at all about false positives, right? So what if, a platform thinks it moderates something that it's, considers harmful, but actually is not, right? So centralizing moderation can actually amplify those collateral damage and essentially harms free speech. There's also this concept called the censorship creep, which essentially means that what starts as a small set of categories for moderation over time expands to something really large, that we end up having very restrictive places to express our opinions. So this is something others have also wondered about. And also, I would say that even though I show you that convergence in moderation could help combat these groups' activity online, we don't really know why platforms converge or why these actors will decide to do so. So I argue that we also need a theory of convergence, but this is for another project. And the last point I wanted to highlight that today I talked about armed groups. I talked about the Oath Keepers. I talked about the Islamic State, about the Taliban. But these kinds of mechanisms in this kind of cross-platform environment are relevant for the resilience of other actors as well. So if you think, for example, about state-sponsored influence operations that are also increasingly taking place on multiple platforms, these kinds of mechanisms could explain those actors' resilience as well. But I will stop here. I know I gave you a lot of information, but this is very much work in progress, and I welcome comments and feedback. So thank you so much.
This is the part. vigorous questions, wonderful pieces. I believe it's Josh. And keep your hands up so that I can make it.
Thank you so much. It's really great. I'm really impressed by the breadth of evidence they're able to bring to bear on this project. I had two quick questions for you. The first is that you talked about how groups may migrate from one platform to another, but I'm curious whether they may also try and get recruits to migrate from one platform to another, particularly if they might try to recruit on the kind of bigger platforms, but then convince those folks to move to the smaller, less moderated platforms where they might be able to be more effectively radicalized. And then second, just curious if you've looked at heterogeneous effects and found, for example, that like more extreme groups are less willing to sacrifice purity in their kind of social media strategy.
I see. These are great questions. And by the way, like I said, this was the first time I'm presenting this, so I'm sure like you'll illuminate me on things I haven't thought about at all. So yeah, on the audience migration, so what I showed you now is kind of a first cut at thinking about those mechanisms. What I would say now, before having thought about it more deeply, is that when we think about platform choice or kind of migrating to those kind of spaces that maximize purity and impact, we would also see efforts to mobilize, it's not the great word, kind of make others follow into these platforms as well, from the same logic. Whether this actually happens or not, I think I would need to dig in more to this, but I think that the same logic would apply. Essentially, if we think about what drives a platform to be chosen, it would be the same. On the heterogeneity point, this is really interesting. So you're suggesting that, now I just talk about all these groups as kind of similar, but there may be some groups that would prefer one set of actions as opposed to others. I really like this idea, and I think I need to think more about what that would mean for this kind of setup that I'm working with, which is characterized by diversity and moderation. One thing I would say, just from this logic, is that we might see groups that are more moderate on the kind of, maybe moderate to extreme scale. We might see those groups more engaging in messaging adaptation on the larger platforms because they may be less banned on those platforms, and the more extreme ones that are completely banned from those trying to engage on less moderate platforms, but it's just the case. I don't know. Thank you.
Great. Following SSP tradition, I have an algorithm that is in my head and will never be revealed for picking people. Biff, you're next.
This was fascinating. Thanks so much. I guess a question I had about the data is that the data set is extremist groups, but you often reference armed groups.
Yes.
And I was wondering specifically, like with comparing the American radical right context with groups like ISIS, whether or not you would expect your theory to also apply to all armed groups in civil war who also have reasonable need to discuss violence, but don't necessarily fit the description of an extremist group,
yeah.
Or maybe they do in your categorization. And then I was really struck by the parallels between your theory and sort of like sanctions policy, where fundamentally you have individuals kicked off of some platforms and they end up unbanked or whatever, but obviously there's huge externalities for individuals experiencing conflict. How do you think about that? I'm just curious where you see yourself going with the externalities.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Thank you so much. So yes, on the point about like what are the set of groups to study. So right now I am including groups on a diverse range of ideologies. I think because I believe that the theory would apply to both, just because of kind of thinking, okay, if they maximize audience reach, then purity and impact would matter. But I think that relates to the previous point by Josh that, there may be heterogeneity that I'm not considering, including whether the group is actually fighting a civil war or whether it's, recruiting people in other countries like the United States, that there's no active civil war. Hopefully there won't be one. But yeah, so right now I'm treating them as uniform. But I agree that with the point that, maybe there's more to unpack about that heterogeneity. The point about sanctions is really interesting. I think the main issue that kind of comes to mind as you were talking was that here I'm talking about the actors that are engaging in the parallel to sanctions are private actors, are technology companies, and are not countries. countries are trying to influence the platforms to moderate. There's like this really interesting dynamic here. But nonetheless, I think there are really interesting parallels by thinking about how a moderation policy for all users of a platform could affect, unrelated users. Yeah, but I'm not sure exactly how to tell you something really smart about this at the moment, but it really intrigued me to think more broadly about what this could be similar or different to. Yeah, thanks.
Great. I had to cheat for this one, I admit. I believe it's Kaylee.
Yes, hi. I have a question about your coding using the content moderation policies. To what extent are you concerned about or just thinking through having a policy but it not being enforced? And maybe there's a discrepancy between having a policy on paper but not actually following through enforcing the terms of the policy. So just how did you deal with that with
Yes.
the coding?
Excellent question. So you are right that the difference between what platforms would like to moderate and what they actually moderate is actually quite huge. And it's such a new area, we still don't know a lot, but there's plenty of anecdotes to kind of make that point that you're making. The way I treat it right now is that I'm assuming that there is a correlation between enforcement and policy. So platforms that have a lot of policies will probably also invest in having moderation teams or moderation systems to moderate more. So between platforms, I expect that to vary in the same direction. But this is not so having a very low threshold does not mean that everything is actually moderated. And in fact, in some of my research on the audience in the mobilization, I actually leveraged the fact that not everyone is moderated, even though they could potentially be. But yeah, this is a great point.
Good.
Yo, thanks. Did you check my photo? Just kidding.
My ability to remember
You're
names
good.
is bad enough that I had to.
I published it. Terrific presentation, and I learned a lot. I have a question that would take some of the analysis you're doing at sort of the micro level and ask a more macro question first, and then I had just two census related, sort of, for want of a better way to describe the question. They're very simple, but on this first one, the question is, why doesn't the convergence and alignment of platforms on moderation that you described also spawn the creation of new, this is the macro question, change the marketplace and spawn the creation of entirely new platforms? And one gets the sense that, I didn't recognize 90% of the icons you had up there. That was a great chart. But do you have a sense of the extent to which the increase in moderation generated the birth, spawned the creation of new, and any evidence that it matters? And so that's the first thing. The second one was, you mentioned that 86% of militia groups use social media, and I'd be really interested in if there's a way to characterize in some coherent way the 14% that aren't using social media. How do they get there? Is there something about them that allows them not to care about using social media? And finally, the adaptation of messaging issue. You have these deplatformed users, obviously they have to go somewhere else. They want to use social media, they leave, and that's fine. But then you also have these simple migrants. So I don't know what you call them. You didn't have a category name for them, but the migrants who just say, well, I want to find a better balance between purity and impact. And the Taliban example was great, but it was both. And I'm just wondering if the ones who are the simple migrants have also been deplatformed, how do you categorize these? Are these three categories the right ones? The deplatform, the simple, and the both, or what? And how should we understand who they are?
Thank you. Those are fabulous comments. So on your first one, absolutely. We have some examples. Even Gab, the platform I was talking about, was created as a result of moderation. So the fact that we have more restrictive policies on the established platforms, certainly one of the consequences is the creation of the new ones. And you actually gave me an idea that it could be nice to see kind of the age of a platform and see how that varies with moderation. So thank you for this idea. But anecdotally, absolutely, that happens. On the 86 versus 14%, I again, more things for me to study and investigate. The way we did this collection was to start very deductively. We have like these groups, we have these platforms. Let's do everything we can to find presence, and that involved many months of hard work. So partly, I just want to bracket this. We could have just some of this might be they used to have a presence, and we just couldn't find it for whatever reason with all of our efforts to investigate. So that's just like perhaps some residual there. But I think that one idea that I think goes back to some of the previous comments between the heterogeneity between the groups themselves. I think that some groups really may just not need these platforms so much. They could be groups that recruit locally, groups that are the audience on these platforms, they seek less global reach or even regional reach in their countries. So these are just my speculations, but I think that this would be really interesting to look into that. So thanks for that as well. Lastly, on the variation between the platforms and the simple and the both, I agree with kind of the comments that I think it reflects a broader issue I need to think about a bit more conceptually is who are the targets of moderation and how they vary. So right now, I'm just treating this set of groups as my subjects, and I'm really interested in why they're so resilient. But you're right that even groups involve a lot of different actors. You have spokespeople, you have supporters, you have sympathizers, you have those that are directly targeted and those that are not. And I think it would be worth thinking first conceptually and then looking at that empirically how their behavior would vary. I want to keep it there, but I think I need to think a bit more conceptually about it first. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in because my question parallels something that Dick raised. So you at the end of the talk said that the theory of convergence is for another project.
Yeah.
I'm worried that it's not. So let me say why, and then tell you some of what I think could help fix the problem that I'm feeling this. So one concern I have about this project, I love this kind of stuff. I think you know that. Like digging into some website and like pulling out the details, well, it's like catnip, right? But I'm worried that the book will be too time limited. That basically you actually have the ability to make bigger theoretical impact here, but by focusing on a pretty narrow slice of time. And right at the point where basically, as far as I can tell, January 6th convinced a bunch of platforms that they had to treat actors like they were militia groups that previously weren't. Like the Oath Keepers were not a militia group, at least in Twitter's eyes before that, right? It was like, we don't know what to do with these people. And then they decided, well, that violence was beyond the pale, even if other... So like, what to do with the fact that it's like a rapidly moving environment? I think theorizing what the platforms are doing would really help me see this as a strategic interaction between a potentially violent group that may or may not be violent yet, and the platform. And the reason the platforms don't do better is they get literally paid not to. Yeah. Like QAnon stuff drives so much traffic. I mean, I think we all know that Facebook makes you angry on purpose because it drives traffic. If you don't know that, that is a thing that we now know, and that's like part of Mark Zuckerberg's problem with why he's testifying before Congress. And so I think that like why are we seeing convergence now? I don't know. I think you have to have a theory there that then these armed groups are like interacting with and thinking about. For me, that would then give you some principles for saying, projecting out into the future, what's going to happen. I think you're going to be the most popular speaker in a certain set of, for companies, for congressional hearings, et cetera. If you can have smart answers about what's going to happen in the next 5 years that are informed by the theoretical framework. I'm curious if you had to at the moment come up with that theory of convergence,
Yeah.
Is it the same as my cynical one, that they're basically trying to maximize ad revenue, and then when basically events force them to lose more revenue by looking bad by hosting hate groups, which I actually think are different than armed groups, then they have to do something? Or do you have a different theory? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so thank you. You can see this is very much a work in progress. So yeah, so
too long of a question.
no, this is good. And actually, so I have part of the theoretical framework as of now does include kind of what platforms are trying to do, what they maximize. Because my focus was so much on the actors that are banned, like what I call the armed groups, but you're completely right that it includes many more. I kind of put that a bit on, I almost treat it as an exogenous part of the theory. So like you have those, so the stakeholders of the platforms that can include the users, governments that might pressure them with sanctions, kind of set the policies, as well as other revenue maximizing reasons, set the policies of the platforms. But this is kind of where I stop. And I'm not treating that as so much of a dynamic process, but I agree with you that you really illuminated how I thought about this, that I was kind of putting out there like, oh, we need a theory of convergence, but actually this is part of the same story. That convergence is driven by the same. So it's like you have a platform that wants to maximize revenue and has users, and then it has a lot of bad things happen to it, and then it changes how it moderates content, which then affects the actors that want to propagate harm on the platform, so there's like a lot going on. So how do you distill this into a theoretical, kind of more simple ideas? But you convinced me that I need to bring the platforms back into the story, because I agree with you that it's a big part of what's happening. And yeah, so thank you. I need to think more about that.
A two-finger. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
My name's Austin. I'm a postdoc here, and I guess this conversation about a theory of convergence raises a question, a broad question that I have about this research, which really has to do with the role of the state, particularly the role of the American federal state, which is by and large absent from the story you tell. So two sort of questions, provocations. One is, in addition to maximizing ad revenue, I wonder if these companies are also minimizing state oversight, because part of this is about evading regulatory capture. And so I wonder to what extent either your theory of convergence and or this entire project is framed by this looming threat of more aggressive federal oversight and regulation of social media platforms.
Yes, so I gave like an early version of this at Columbia a few months ago, and I had this like joke that like basically I had this like chapter 2 idea that is like basically the story of the state, and I had so much to say. I haven't written that chapter yet, by the way, and I said like this is part of chapter 2, this is part of chapter 2, but which essentially kind of I think makes your point about how the power of the state in the story is huge. Mainly at driving platform behavior. I think that the United States regulation or possible regulation is a big one, but you also see that in other countries. So many other countries are trying to regulate the platforms in their jurisdictions, which does drive some of these policies for sure. So in my view, at the moment, and that's probably if you see the next version of this talk or book, hopefully will come out at some point soon, so at this moment, I'm treating all the factors that influence the platforms to have the threshold that it has as being part of a bundle of things that the platform maximizes. I think that state pressure is actually one of the biggest ones in this story. But again, at the moment, I'm treating it as exogenous. So this is the environment that we are facing. But you all are trying to convince me more and more that actually this should be unpacked more and understood more. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Next I have Suzanne.
Great. Hi. So my question is essentially about sort of, given the research that you've done so far, do you have any ideas on sort of the solution to dealing with sort of these users that have grievances generated by moderation and then go to other platforms and are radicalized there by these groups? So clearly sort of the current moderation standards don't necessarily prevent what it is that we were actually concerned about. So do you have any potential ideas for sort of how platforms might behave differently, or sort of do you even view your research as being relevant to sort of making up better moderation policies?
Yeah, so thank you. First, I want to say that I don't have the perfect solution. I wish I did. But I agree with, I think that this research already has pointed to some problems that, we could potentially fix. So one, I think, knowing how the current environment and the diversity that we have in moderation shapes actors' behavior is one thing. But if you noted, a lot of my work focused on deplatforming, which is the most severe possible sanction a platform could post on a user. And some have argued that maybe we need to not shut down voices so much, but engage in softer moderation efforts to prevent that kind of reaction. I am not sure these are any much better, but for example, there is this ideas of, making somebody, if somebody is making, comments that people don't like to see, then maybe don't shut down the user, but make them less visible to others, right? Again, full of problems. I'm not suggesting that that's the solution, but I think thinking through about how the psychological effects of being rejected from a platform can be so profound that it can actually induce mobilization on other spaces, I think that perhaps should make us think about maybe there are softer things that could be done to avoid that. But again, I want to stay humble. I don't have the perfect solution here. Thanks.
Ben.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It is always a little gloomy to learn about armed militant trying to overthrow the government in our country. And sorry, I'm Ben Harris, before your PhD candidate. So I have a question both on the theory and on the methodology. So theoretically, it follows a bit of what Dick and Rich asked about in terms of it seems like there's an exogenous assumption that these militant groups go to social networks as is. And adapt to them based on the two criteria that you mentioned. But it does really seem like especially powerful and influential militant groups are going to be able to influence platforms either through direct influencing of trying to protest content being taken down, or also through the creation of alternative social media platforms, where a platform like Parler really confuses the distinction between a platform and a militant group. And so. Yeah, I am curious about the causality going the other way in the story. Methodologically, I'm also curious about how confident in your data collection that you were able to actually find all militant groups' accounts on the platform. Because especially with the example you gave of the Islamic State, they're going through pretty significant measures to evade detection, and I imagine that also posed issues for the research team. And then, finally, just on moderation, again, going back to the example of Parler, it's interesting to see these platforms actually moderate the other way, Parler, sort of bans liberal content. And so I'm curious, how you would code that.
And then I guess, finally, if I'm allowed to finish.
I'm going to have to impose 4 questions. You can finish what you were saying.
I'm curious about the theory going a step up. So it's okay, if militant groups can control platforms, what about the actions of underlying internet infrastructure in terms of AWS taking Parler offline, or other companies that people haven't heard of actually controlling access to the internet?
Yeah.
You're fine. That last one's good.
Thank you. This great set of comments. So yeah, I think that your point about the creation of new spaces by the actors that are banned, we have seen that. Even the Islamic State has tried to create its own app at some point, and now there is increasing attention to websites, kind of going back to the olden days. So I think yes, absolutely, and that relates to earlier comments about how does moderation just cause more proliferation in the online spaces? So I think this is kind of nice to think about the creation of new spaces as another reaction, right? So it's not just, we're not talking just about the 60 whatever platforms I just showed you, but there could be maybe infinite more spaces. about the collection of group presence. So I want to give credit to my team of RAs. We really belabor this very seriously. So essentially, the way the collection worked is that we started with the groups, and we did deep research on what the group's ideology is, kind of like really understanding the group. And then through mostly secondary sources, as well as primary logging into all of these platforms under a pseudonym account, we try to find any possible presence we could find using logos, using, words that tend to be associated with these groups in the local contents where they organize. So from my perspective, kind of knowing how this collection could be done, it's the most you could get from like an open source public presence point of view, including Telegram channels and all of those. But what we did was we didn't look at all the possible accounts of all possible groups. We basically stopped it once we saw an official presence. We said, okay, there is an official presence here. So it's not comprehensive to the extent of like having the full network of a group on a platform. We don't have. Your point about internet service providers and other actors, I think this is really good. And also I wanted to actually show you this. So this is what the moderation threshold was created from. So it focuses on policies. This is a lot of text here, but essentially there are 9 different categories of moderation that tend to reoccur in the moderation policies of platforms, and this is those that I focus on. So if Parler, for example, moderates liberal content, it's just not in this set of categories. Maybe it should be. Right now it's not. So for that reason, Parler, even though it moderates other types of content, it will appear to have a higher threshold based on these criteria. And similar for other types of technology companies or internet service providers that have different ways where they moderate, like shutting down a service. So this is outside of the scope at the moment, but I agree that it's relevant for this project more generally. Maybe I should focus on them as well. We'll see. Thank you.
Daniel.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Siebel, I'm a first-year student. So something that stood out to me was that the first slide you showed, you had like Discord listed as the bottom, and I think something that is interesting about this research is that, and research in this nature generally, is that it almost always looks at text-based or audio-visual-based platforms, right? But obviously Discord is primarily an audio service, and like Twitch is like an audio streaming service. So I guess the scoping question, is this research encapsulating those other sort of audio-based platforms, which are obviously much more difficult to monitor? A lot of the moderation, it gets kicked to like the groups themselves, and so they never actually pop up to the platforms because no one in the group is going to report them for violating content moderation policies. So I'm sort of curious how you're capturing them, if you are, and how you, if you would want to, how you go about trying to.
Yeah, thank you. This is also goes to the question about like the difference between a policy and an enforcement. So right now the set of platforms I have and like the nice figure that I would call the icons that I'm really proud of. It was really fun to make. Basically uses platforms that folks in industry that kind of study these topics have pointed to these. So particularly one wonderful NGO called Tech Against Terrorism, that they focus on the kind of helping platforms moderate, content, and they have basically found a large set of platforms that they found activity on, and they focus on groups that are designated as terrorist groups by different states. So this was the initial set of platforms that I used. That included a lot of different types of services. So it's not just like text or image, also audio, as well as file sharing services. So all of these are included here. Interestingly, many of them moderate using the same language. Like one thing I actually haven't said, and that relates to Convergence, is how much imitation there is between the way platforms moderate. And I think there's a lot of kind of learning happening. So I think in terms of having the policy is one thing, but enforcing is another. And I think I heard some talks by some people at Trust and Safety talk about moderating content on their platform, like Zoom, like SoundCloud, and Discord, and they talked about how difficult, like for example, Zoom it doesn't access any of the content that is shared on a meeting, but they do have information on the title. So if you're like the metadata, right? So that's like the most information you get. So you are completely correct that another source of variation here is the ability to enforce, the ability to observe. Thank you. This is a really nice comment.
So next I have Raymond. That is the end of the list because someone had to leave early. Hopefully I get an email from them. Is there someone that I've missed by not seeing hands? Raymond, go ahead. Others still have
So, yeah, thanks for a really cool presentation. I guess I have two fairly formed thoughts. The first is kind of building on Jack's question, is like there seems to be on the sort of heterogeneous groups. It seems like there's a really cool way to like track how group aims change, right? Like as a group, not just like form groups, but like, you know, just like organizations, as groups sort of evolve and go through a life cycle, it seems that they would prioritize different, you know, recruitment, mobilization, like and sort of messaging, right? It seems that their ideal point, their preferences between these three aims would shift. It'll be a really cool way to like, you know, you already have the data, right? Like, so it'll be a cool way to like kind of see if their aims shift over time, and does that correlate with, you know, either certain features of the group, where like, are they inclusionary, are they exclusionary? There are certain groups I can imagine that, you know, actually don't want the white membership. So that was just one thought. Second thought is on the issue of like the convergence theory, right? Like this seems to be, I mean, when it comes down to this, seems to be a case of regulatory arbitrage, right? Like you have firm, these are different firms, and they have different regulations, and actors try to arbitrage between them. So that got me thinking about like this seems to be, it might be helpful to look into like the tacit collusion literature, right, between firms, and it seems that we're in this weird, if moderation policy, or how stringent it is like the price that the firm sets, it seems that normatively we want to encourage a cartel, right, of high price firms. And I think the literature in the econ on like tacit collusion, like the structure, how you can, I guess the reverse of antitrust, right? Like how you can encourage cartels, like under what conditions do cartels form, might be very interesting. You know, like transparency, switching costs, etc. So that might be it.
Thank you. There's
another set of great comments. So on your first one, I think this is interesting to think about the use of these different mechanisms of evasion over time, or over evolution of a group. Yes, so again, right now I think about it as like, what are groups maximizing? They want audience, they want impact. But you're right, that maybe there are some points in time in the evolution of a group's life that it might not want that, and it might emphasize other types of goals. Yeah, I want to think a bit more about what that means for kind of the theory of kind of resilience more generally, but I agree with you that it does make sense that we might not see the variation of these mechanisms vary only with platform characteristics, but also with the group's own goals. On your point about tacit collusion, the kind of literature on content moderation is kind of, you know, we don't have a lot of it at the moment in political science. We have great work on censorship, but kind of focuses on slightly different questions. The legal scholarship has kind of made a lot of strides in this direction, thinking about it from like the legal normative points of view. But there's exactly a discussion. If you're interested, a scholar I really like that works on it is Evelyn Dueck. She's at Stanford. And she talks about the content cartels, essentially the same idea that, you know, on one hand, we all call for this kind of inter-platform collaboration to stop harms. You often see that after attacks, like after Christchurch in 2019, we saw that. So on one hand, you see this kind of push for more convergence, but at the same time, there's a host of problems that could come up with having that kind of cartel. So yeah, I'm engaging with a little legal work on this, but I'm curious to read more about the economics literature on this, so thanks for the idea.
Great. Yeah, as long as we've got a couple of extra minutes.
Thank you. This is incredibly thought-provoking, but I wanted to maybe put a couple of these questions together and probe a little bit more, again, on the issue of convergence. I'm glad Raymond used the word life cycle, but I was thinking of life cycle in terms of the life cycle of the platforms themselves. So when the platform is relatively new, its user base is tiny, you know, it can carve out a niche by allowing purity or not moderating, right? As it gets bigger and it wants to get even bigger, there may be incentives to move, right? So first of all, it's gotten bigger, it may be subject to more scrutiny from the government, so more pressure on that end, as well as more incentive maybe to increase its ad revenues. So there might be this sort of migration or life cycle of the platforms. I guess, a part of my question is what the barriers to entry are, and to come back to Dick's question then, if you've got sort of this continual flow and you've got new actors then cropping up to take the place of those niche, small based platforms, how realistic is the idea of convergence, or are there barriers to entry that are high enough such that convergence, even just at that one end, is sufficient? So yeah, that's
really great comments. I think it's kind of nice, like step back kind of question. So yes, if you think about the platform's life cycle and like what makes platform moderate, and that goes back to Richard's point and others, I think that there is certainly, when a platform begins, not just for like a normative reason or like revenue maximizing reasons, it's even just like having people to moderate. Moderation is expensive for platforms. It's not something that they necessarily want to do. So when a platform is just starting out, it may not even have the people to moderate. There was this really interesting example by a platform that was kind of operated by one person in Poland called Just Paste It. There was just like this file sharing platform, like, very small, that became this like host of ISIS propaganda. At the time, the group was kind of trying to find spaces. And when the person that was kind of, in charge of the platform was trying to say like, oh, why do I have all this propaganda on my platform? He decided to moderate it for lack of other resources by shutting down all content in Arabic, which was completely crazy because you think about collateral damage, right? So what happened with this platform, I think, is illustrative. So basically they went to the larger platforms and asked for advice, and they ended up, if I'm completely, I think I remember it correctly, they started using what's called the file sharing database, which is essentially this centralized information where ISIS propaganda is located, that you can essentially use a tool to identify it. So then you don't just have to shut down all content in Arabic, but just focus on this particular set of content. So I think this example, illustrates not only the fact that there is a life cycle. As platform grows, it does encounter more demands from governments also to moderate, precisely because of its impact. But it's also kind of a question about enforcement, or the ability to enforce. I think that your point about like convergence more generally, like is convergence like the figure, like I showed you a flat line, like is it even attainable? I don't think so, right? You will always have those other spaces that will be, either by ideology or for other reasons moderating less. And I think this is why I'm not a pessimistic person at all in my life, but I think that this is a bit grim, because in a way this will be a challenge that we kind of always face, right? Even if we have convergence, there will still be this variation. So if this variation exists and that leads to resilience, then there will always be resilience. So maybe it's a question about degree. And that's something maybe I need to think more about. But I agree with you that the point about convergence is not something that we'll probably ever achieve realistically. Yeah.
This has been wonderful. We're at the hour. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.